This particular event is more informal, since you've been sitting around all day and you're probably about to commit an atrocity at this point. It's wonderful material and everything, but we're all exhausted. So I'm just going to speak for 59 out of the 60 minutes and make sure and reserve the 1 minute. No, we'll just go a little while and then open up the floor, and you say or ask anything you want. Just get everything off your chest that you have about this subject, because I'm telling you, I know there are some people who are thinking, that historians don't know what they're talking about. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight, okay? Historians don't know what they're talking about. It's much better to read an economist doing history than it is to read a historian doing history half the time. Seems to me, my view is that historians like to give the impression that there's some secret knowledge you need to be a historian. There's this craft and all this and that. And I guess there sort of is. You have to know how to be critical about the use of sources and this and that. But, for heaven's sake, at some level, it just amounts to learning material and teaching it to people. Whereas economics is, a discipline that requires years of training and thinking and study and scholarship. And the problem is that most historians don't have that. Whereas economists can pick up what historians have, I think, in the course of writing a book. Whereas a historian who lacks economic knowledge is in big trouble. But in even bigger trouble are the people who read this poor soul. Now, let me first say that I first attended the Mises University as a student in 1993. You can still see the photos of the various years of the Mises University in the hallway up here on the second floor. So you can find me in the 1993 photo. I'm in the green shirt toward the front. I'm still, for some reason, it's 1993, but I am clinging to that 80s haircut for dear life. And I remember that it was an incredibly rewarding experience. I mean, for one thing, Murray Rothbard was still alive. We all loved him, and it was a real experience. And he stayed up later than any of us. His secret was he would sleep until 2 in the afternoon. So everybody would say, how is he staying up until 4? Well, he's got all day to sleep it off, I guess. But he was just wonderful. There was so much enthusiasm. And I remember in particular that there was one day we had half the day off. You guys have that coming up on Wednesday. This was when we had the conferences out in California. See, in my day, we didn't have a nice, beautiful facility like this, okay, that you guys have, okay? In my day, you went to California and you liked it, okay? I'm telling you, I don't know how we got through it, folks. Well, anyway, the day off we had, a group of us we'd sort of gotten to know each other, and we all went out to Hollywood. And we ended up sitting in for the taping of a show that totally bombed and never went anywhere. It was a jury program featuring Star Jones. This was back when I don't think just anybody cared about Star Jones at that time. Kind of like today, right? Basically. But anyway, it was this jury show, and the idea was that the audience would be the jury. You'd bring your case, and the audience would be the jury. And I don't remember the details of the case, but the libertarian analysis of the case was so obvious. So we're all voting no, innocent, whatever. And so we thought, oh, well, this guy's definitely, it's no problem, everything's fine, he doesn't owe the plaintiff anything. And of course, it was like 89% in favor of the plaintiff, and like it was our votes at all that got any votes for the defendant. So it was a little frustrating. We thought, who would ever come on this show and just say, a bunch of dopes off the street, why don't you decide my case? But then we realized, isn't that pretty much the system we have now, more or less? But anyway, it was a wonderful experience, and so keep open minds, enjoy yourselves, learn everything you can, introduce yourselves to people. Okay, I mean, you'll really enjoy it. And you may be like me. You may be saying, I read the material, I'm all ready for this thing, and I can pretty much follow you guys about 85% of the way, but some of this stuff is just a little bit odd or radical for me. Well, you just wait till the end of the week, folks. Okay, you let this stuff sink in. You'll be surprised. Well, what I want to talk about is that the title of this talk that I was given is Economics and the Historians, which is obviously derived from the book that Hayek wrote, or edited, collection of essays, in the 50s, around 1954, I think, called Capitalism and the Historians. Now, Professor Rako last night made brief mention of this, and it seems to me, I think you should get a hold of this book, and particularly, you should read the Hayek essay in it, because it's an excellent, I think it's one of the best things Hayek ever wrote. It's called History and Politics. And I remember, in my junior year in college, we were getting to it's called the junior tutorial. We were getting to the section on the Industrial Revolution. And this is what the Hayek essay, the whole book is on, really is on the Industrial Revolution and the effects it had on ordinary people. And I remember suggesting that we should read Hayek's essay, just to give some kind of balance to the discussion. I may as well have been speaking Chinese. We should read what? By whom? But we ended up reading it. I managed to force everyone to read it. That's, by the way to become popular. Is you insist that the class do additional reading on top of what they're already doing. Oh, they love me. They love me. Couldn't get enough of Tom Woods. Well, in any event, the point that Hayek makes in this essay is that the way we understand history influences the way we think about current events. So if we have an erroneous understanding of history, a faulty understanding of history, we're going to have a faulty understanding of current events. And the specific example he's giving involves the Industrial Revolution. Because the argument he's making is, if we believe that the Industrial Revolution was nothing but a catastrophe for everybody, that there was nothing to be said in its favor, it was just an unmitigated catastrophe for the ordinary person, that's going to influence the way we think now, because we're going to think to ourselves, well, that was an example of capitalism, and it led to, everybody died, or everybody was crawling around eating dirt and grunting, and so therefore we can't have capitalism because look at what it leads to. We need the government to regulate things. So that's an example of how history influences the way we think about current events. Well, in any event, this Hayek book is part of what became known as the standard of living debate on the Industrial Revolution. Did the Industrial Revolution on net benefit people, or was it in fact a catastrophe that befell the working population? Now, given that we have Roderick Long in the room, I am going to say that I understand there is a certain Kevin Carsonian proviso to all this that I will address at the end. But having said that, let me just go into some of the points that Hayek makes. First of all, this standard of living debate is not something that just goes back to the 1940s. It really goes all the way back to the 1830s. I mean, Macaulay was already speaking in favor of the advances in living standards that had taken place during the Industrial Revolution. And then this debate over whether the Industrial Revolution had been good or bad on net, whether it had impoverished or slightly enriched people, it continued sort of in fits and starts, but it really was reignited in the late 1940s when T.S. Ashton wrote a couple of important articles. Ashton had wrote books on the Industrial Revolution. He wrote a book on, it was an economic history of England, and he wrote a couple of articles. One of them was in the Journal of Economic History, and the other one was in whatever the publication of the Manchester Statistical Society was, and 48 and 49. And these articles almost single-handedly revived the discussion. Well, Hayek was part of that discussion, and the other scholars, in fact, Ashton makes a contribution to capitalism in the historians. So they're carrying forward a long-standing discussion. And the argument that was made by what we might call the optimists, the school to which Hayek belonged, was that it is not a complete story simply to say that people during the Industrial Revolution suffered tremendously, worked almost inhuman hours in very, very difficult conditions for wages that we would not care to work for. All of that is true, but it's not sufficient. It's not a sufficient telling of the tale, because there are some other factors to bear in mind here. For one thing, we have to remember how bad things were before the Industrial Revolution. There is this sense that there was a kind of a Garden of Eden situation, and then all of a sudden, factories appeared, and everyone was covered in soot, and that was the end of it. And I don't mean to make light of that, because I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to work in a factory at going into the 19th century. It would have been pretty rotten. And I'm glad I wasn't around then. I have the good fortune of living on the capital that was provided then. But the point that Hayek and others have made is that conditions were extremely bad in rural society by any statistical measure in terms of food intake and living space. Things were pretty rotten. Hayek also makes the argument that capitalism, in effect, created the proletariat, but not in the sense that a Marxist would say. A Marxist, I don't know if this is really a caricature of Marxism or not, but a Marxist would in effect say that capitalism creates the proletariat in that it sort of dispossesses and exploits an already existing population. But Hayek says that actually capitalism creates the proletariat in that it makes possible the material basis for these people to live and survive at all. Because it makes it possible for people who don't have their own land and don't have the tools to go into business and have their own shop still to work in the economy somehow as wage earners. There is at least something for them to do. And Hayek says this is how capitalism creates the proletariat. Now, one argument that had been made, at least by some of this, what we might call the pessimists, was things must have gotten worse for the working class because we see social reformers decrying the situation and calling attention to the squalor and the poverty in which so many people lived. So this in itself is highly suggestive, it was argued. But Hayek turned that argument completely around and said that in fact this may prove exactly the opposite point. Because what Hayek said is that if you live in a society where everybody is dirt poor, and everybody knows everybody's going to be dirt poor, and there's not a thing you can do about it, nobody complains. What's the point of complaining? You know, I mean, you may as well complain about the sun rising. There's not a thing you can do about it. But when all of a sudden it seems to you that this situation may be avoidable, that you're living in a society where enough wealth has been created that poverty now becomes a conspicuous thing, it begins to appear to you that you may be able to resolve this problem, well, that's when you start to see social criticism. So Hayek actually argued that the existence of social critics, in fact, suggested that there had been an advance in wealth. So I think that's actually rather an interesting and provocative claim. He also said that a lot of the historians who studied the early Industrial Revolution went into that study with a certain axe to grind, with an ideological axe to grind. They believed that the nature of the system, and every time I say that, I'm thinking of the Holy Grail, you know, that the violence inherent in the system. I'm sorry, but some of you have not seen that, apparently. It's a Monty Python film. Yeah, right. Well, in any event, you know, so anyway, one of the arguments that was made. What am I saying? So violence inherent in the system. It's a coconut can't be carried by that kind of a swallow. In any event. Yeah, right. They had this axe to grind. Yeah, thanks. So in any event, they go into this sort of assuming that this is the nature of things. That in a free economy, the nature of things is that the owners exploit the people who don't own, who basically just own their own bodies. And so naturally, Hayek says it's not a surprise that when you go into a study with this kind of an ideological preconception, it's not a surprise they found what they were looking for, but that this is not. This is not the dispassionate analysis of a real scholar. Now, that's not to say that you should go into the study of history with no preconceptions whatsoever, because that's equally fruitless. Because if you have no preconceptions, how would you even know what facts are worth recording? I mean, history consists of every single thing that's ever happened. How would you even know what was relevant? I mean, you have to have some understanding of how the economy works. So the point is it has to be a correct one, rather than just an ideologically motivated one. Well, there are a great many studies that have been done on this matter, and it does seem that on balance, if you look at measures like caloric intake and living space and life expectancy and things like that, it does seem that we can say that these things did increase for the working class. I mean, there's one study that was done about 20 years ago that concluded that real incomes doubled in the first century after about 1760. And in fact, Max Hartwell of Oxford was one of the optimists, actually said in 1970, is the debate really over? Is this standard of living debate really over? Have the optimists won? And he in effect said, it seems that on paper it is over. He says, because even E.P. Thompson was a Marxist who studied the working class, even he said that really nobody at this point is still arguing that everything became worse. Well, this is an interesting debate, I think. And it's an example, albeit a rare one, of an actual debate among historians on an economic matter. This makes it something of a rarity, as I'm going to suggest in a moment, because typically what happens is there's one point of view in most history texts, and it's not even so much that the historians are secretly meeting in some smoke-filled room discussing how they can suppress the truth. It's that they don't even consider the possibility that there could be another way of looking at many things. The Industrial Revolution debate has been a bit of an exception to that. I do want, in parentheses, though, to make reference to an important proviso here. Because in recent months and years, there has arisen a kind of a critique of the optimists in what we might call maybe left libertarian circles or what is... Well, now let's all behave ourselves here, people, right? Toleration. And the argument sort of goes like this, that it's not right just simply to analyze, to go as far as we've gone here without acknowledging that some of the movement of people from the countryside into the towns, into working in the factories, that this was not just a spontaneous movement of free peoples rationally assessing their situation and deciding that they should move to the factories. Rather, it was state measures that in effect put them in that situation where really the only real alternative they had was to go to the factory. So that so the argument here is that a libertarian is being sort of vulgar if he's just going to say, oh, well, it's the free market at work and people decided that this was the way they wanted to do things and so it was their own free choice and they decided to go to the factories. No, they were basically driven to the factories by state measures. Now, I was actually referred to on, some of you probably know who Kevin Carson is, and I think he's sort of like some of my anti-war stuff, which I appreciate. But he actually referred to me as a vulgar libertarian once. And I thought, well, that's just not a nice term, like a vulgar libertarian. And so my initial thought was, I'm using curse words or I'm eating like a slob. But all he means is that my analysis is too simplistic. Well, my brief answer to this is that, for instance, one of the arguments that he and others would make is that the enclosure movement, in effect, forced people off the land. So that this sort of state-driven movement created this propertyless, landless class that had no other option other than to go to the factories. But what I would just say briefly here is that the jury is out, at the very least, on the subject of the consequences of the enclosure movement, by the way, involved what had been common lands that had been free for use of anybody. You couldn't plant on it, but you could do anything short of that. You could use it for grazing and other purposes. And those lands were made into private property gradually over the course of centuries. And it's been argued that pushed some of the marginal farmers into the cities, because if you're a marginal farmer, one little thing and you're basically sunk, and you don't have the option of using the commons anymore. This could be enough to drive people into the cities. But Hartwell and Ashton have some pretty substantial evidence that the enclosure movement was not really that significant in this. And Ashton simply says it is sufficient to note that the wages in the factories were very good by people's standards then. And he says that the problem is historians just cannot get away from this idea that the people on the farms must have been driven from the land. This is just, Ashton says, you just can't get historians to think any other way. They couldn't have just made a rational decision. The poor never make rational decisions. They're always driven by inexorable forces beyond their control. And in one of his books, Ashton even quotes a historian who says, the higher wages being offered in the cities drove people from their lands, like this is some great catastrophe of some kind. Well, in any event, so go and get, not now, but go and get Hayek's essay and look at it. It's very, very worthwhile. In my talks later in the week, I'm going to be more specific, and I want to give some specific readings that you might pursue. If you have history or economics professors that you're reasonably sure of your grade and that the person isn't so petty that he's going to punish you for having independent thoughts, but I'm going to give you some good reading suggestions in good journals where you're going to have some ideas that they've never heard of, and you'll just have good fun with it, and you can write to me and tell me how it went. But for now, I just want to speak very generally so we can open it up in just at least a little while, and just say that, for instance, if you look at typical American history textbook, it doesn't have too many things like the standard of living debate in it. A Western Civ textbook today will acknowledge that there's a debate on this question. But if you read an American history textbook about, say, the 1930s, the only real debate will be, did FDR go far enough in his interventions into the economy? I mean, he didn't do this, he didn't do that, he didn't totally nationalize industry. I mean, this is the only criticism you're allowed to make. So what I find is that the major problem historians have is that they haven't absorbed Henry Hazlitt's one lesson, okay? By the way, there's a wonderful shirt you can get with Henry Hazlitt on it. I mean, what other institute in the world can you get a T-shirt with Henry Hazlitt on it, people? Amazing. Anyway, Henry Hazlitt, you all know, wrote Economics in one lesson. The one lesson, as again, I'm sure you all know, is that it is not sufficient when you're evaluating an economic policy to look at its short-term consequences for one earmarked group. That's easy. I can see that a make-work project builds a bridge. Yes, okay, any idiot can see that. And it puts me to work building the bridge. Yes, I can also see that. But Hazlitt says you have to instead consider the effects of the policy in the long term on everybody, not just in the short term on one designated group. And he has a beautiful chapter that Joe Salerno reminded me of, because it's been years since I read it, on make-work projects, where the government says we're going to tax you, take the money away, and pay it to Joe Blow to go build a stadium or whatever. He's got a wonderful chapter on this, because he's got this beautiful sarcasm. And I know that normally we want to be, in some ways, Hayekian, generous toward our opponents and assume the best about them, assume they're not scoundrels who just want to impoverish everybody. Start off that way, assume that. But Hazlitt has this wonderful chapter where he says, I understand that some people can't imagine what jobs would have been created if this money hadn't been taxed away to pay for this. If the people still had that money, what would they have spent it on? And what jobs would have been supported by that expenditure of the money? Or can you imagine what would have been built in the absence of this program if that money had been left in private hands and built on something else? Well, you can't see the stadium that would have been built, or the school that would have been built, or the jobs that would have been created there, because that requires some imagination. You have to use your mind to think of that. I understand most people can see only with their eyes. They can't see with their imaginations. And in effect, he's obviously got a real point there. So these projects, of course it's true, they put people to work. And it's not enough just to say, by the way, that some of these make-work projects are just silly in and of themselves. In Cambridge, for example, Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the jobs that at some point along the line was a make-work job was they had perfectly good sidewalks in Harvard Square. Then they ripped them all up and replaced them with brick sidewalks. The problem is that half the bricks are sticking up out of the ground. So you can't walk on these sidewalks at all without killing yourself. So everybody's in a bad mood walking around Harvard Square. You get bruises everywhere. It is true that the WPA did have a job. It did pay people to chase starlets off the White House lawn. Now we can all see that that's a ridiculous waste of money. I actually, it's not starlets. That's right. I had to make that correction. Yeah, that was a Clinton administration. That's right. Because when I was on some show and they did the transcript of it, and I was saying, blah, 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 FDR paid people to chase starlings off the White House lawn, and they had it as starlets. And so I've never been able to get that out of my head. In the transcript, they had me saying starlets. So now forever I've got starlets in my head because of that. No, obviously, again, that would be a Clinton administration program. Well, in any event, it's not enough just to say the programs are silly. It's the programs displace other things. And there have been studies that have tried to suggest that one for one, they displace productive jobs. Jobs that are geared toward producing things that consumers have voluntarily indicated that they want. But what you see in a textbook treatment is, FDR had these wonderful make-work projects, and they gave people jobs. And that's the end of the discussion. There's nothing further, nothing whatsoever. So as somebody with an economic turn of mind, you have to be able to address this and answer it. And you're going to find that you're pretty much all alone. This is why we need more people who have economic training to be doing some history. Because otherwise what you have are historians with no economic training. What they wind up doing is, A, accepting everything at face value. This program creates jobs, well then that's what I'm going to write in the book. Or they just wind up accepting whatever the conventional wisdom is. Or they just wind up just copying down what was in the textbook that they learned from. So the same inanities are just repeated over time, and nothing is able to penetrate in there. So we need more economic training for these poor souls. Beyond that, now I'll just give another brief example, and then we'll take questions and comments and horror stories about things you've endured. But now Tom DiLorenzo is probably, you're going to talk about antitrust this week?
I don't think so.
Oh, isn't that funny? No antitrust talk from Tom DiLorenzo. Okay. Well, you can all talk to Tom DiLorenzo privately outside, right? You go buy his book, even better, How Capitalism Saved America. But people, historians, say the most obviously inane and provably false things about antitrust legislation and its consequences. Because they've never really looked at it that much detail. They just think, if you leave the free market to itself, you're going to get giant businesses who are going to enslave us all. That's it. That is the depth of their knowledge. They have not pursued it at all. Tom DiLorenzo has actually bothered to go and do original research on this. Well, let's see. Did the allegedly monopolized industries in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, were they raising prices or were they lowering prices? Nobody bothered to even check. It was just assumed because we have this sort of a priori knowledge of history. Well, we know big business is bad. It must have been exploiting everybody. We don't even need to check. Well, Tom DiLorenzo bothered to check, and it turns out that exactly the opposite is true. That the allegedly monopolized industries were the ones that were lowering their prices the most dramatically and increasing their output the most dramatically. So much for that. Or one of my favorites involves the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, as you all know, was this sort of giveaway program after World War II, originally designed for any country in Europe for reconstruction. And Czechoslovakia initially indicated they would like to get some of this, and they were made quite clear by the Soviet Union you were not taking any of this. So it was sort of like, raising their hands and then gradually putting it back down again. So it was pretty much confined to Greece and then westward. And the idea was, there were a couple of ideas. I mean, number one was the thought that American prosperity depends on European prosperity. So we've got to get the Europeans up and running again. Secondly, the thought was that poverty and despair lead to communism. Because people think, well, we got no choice, we might as well become communists because look at what capitalism has done. I think most people would probably conclude that maybe the reason that they're poor is that they did just endure World War II. It's probably not entirely capitalism's fault. But anyway, that is that sort of argument. So that's why we need to have the Marshall Plan. And because Western European recovery followed the Marshall Plan, either was contemporaneous with or followed the Marshall Plan, the completely unwarranted assumption conclusion has been drawn that therefore the Marshall aid caused the recovery. But of course that's a logical fallacy. I mean, it could be that the aid caused the recovery, but that's not necessary. So in any event, though, this has become the conventional wisdom. The Marshall Plan led to Western European recovery. And there's been only a very little bit of challenging this. So I challenged it a little bit in my politically incorrect guide to American history. Well, when the New York Times went after the book, and I'm sorry to make this self-referential little anecdote, but I can't resist. First of all, it was the greatest boon I've ever had. The New York Times attacking me is like I can retire now, happy. An institution that has done more to damage American civilization than you can imagine. So they didn't like it at all. But the hilarious thing was that the guy writing it, let's just say his name, Adam Cohen, okay? He writes this thing, and he's got this paragraph where he's listing all the terrible things I said. And he doesn't refute any of them. He just figures that reciting them is sufficient condemnation. This is indictment enough. And one of the things I said that was so terrible was that the Marshall Plan was not responsible for European recovery. There were other factors at work. And his response to this was, can you believe this guy said this? Doesn't he know that the Marshall Plan was... So in other words, all he does is just repeats the very thing I'm trying to refute as if that's a refutation. As if I've never heard that argument. Like that's the only argument there is. I don't know if any of you saw in the old days, there was an old Saturday Night Live skit called Helmet Head. Anybody ever see Helmet Head? He's a soldier. He had a helmet stuck to his head from some war. For years, he could never get the helmet off. And he had people trying to blowtorch. He could not get this helmet off. And then every crazy thing they would try to get the helmet off, at the end they would say to him, have you tried soap and water? I've had this helmet on my head for 5 years. And you're asking me if of course I've tried soap and water. Well, in the sort of same way, that wasn't really that relevant, but only in this way. In the same way, of course I know that people have said the Marshall Plan did this. Well, the argument that I made, is largely comes from Tyler Cowen, who did a great chapter on this, and the citation is in my bibliography. But pointing out that for one thing, even if we just want to look at direct evidence of causality, there is the slight problem that France, Italy, and Germany began their economic recoveries before they got any Marshall aid. So that's going to be a little difficult to explain. Or that Austria and Greece didn't really get started with their recovery until Marshall aid was basically phased out. So how do you, or Britain got a ton of Marshall aid, and we all know their economy lagged behind others. So just staying on their level, it's not obvious that this thing is responsible for that. What does seem to be responsible is the return to some kind of semblance of a market economy. These Nazi-occupied countries had adopted the same, economic codes, controls on the economy, and when they were lifted, well, by some miracle, prosperity was restored again. It's particularly in West Germany. That's what happened. It's also a fact, by the way, that the Marshall Plan, there's a provision that for every dollar of American aid that you get, the government has to expand the public sector by $1, investing in infrastructure projects and stuff. So in other words, every dollar of Marshall aid doubles the public sector of that recipient country by $2. So it's a disaster. So again, if you have some kind of economic frame of mind, you know that expanding the public sector does not lead to prosperity. So therefore, the Marshall Plan is probably not not altogether responsible for this. So that should not be this massively controversial statement, but you won't hear any mainstream historian saying it. But as I say, there is so much evidence you have on your side and so much suggestive evidence that you should use it. You should go out there, and I'm telling you, there's no professor who's ever heard of this stuff. They just repeat it. So knowledge of economics is necessary if you want to do good history. That is my very sort of banal and very uninspiring conclusion, but thank you very much, and throw some comments and thoughts at me. I'd be happy to entertain. Let's see how we're doing. Oh, fine. Okay.
Quick question here.
Oh, okay. Yes, okay, then we'll get that.
I never even knew about Austrian economics until my freshman year in college. Once I finally heard about it, latched onto it, loved it ever since. I think that quite possibly could be a lot of the rest of America's problem. Any idea why the rest of mainstream America hasn't picked up and ran with it?
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, part of the reason is the very. Oh, by the way, for people who are listening in, I'll just say that the gentleman is asking, why is it that that he himself has only become familiar with Austrian economics, in college like this, but and yet, and most Americans haven't heard of it at all. Why is this? Why is it like the best kept secret, of American intellectual life? Why is that? Well, part of it is that if people aren't getting it in college, then that's a big problem. That's the great thing about the Mises Institute. They've been placing a tremendous number of people in academic positions around the country, and so attracting students like you guys to here. So it's wonderful. But well, I mean, you have to think there isn't really the same kind of incentive structure to familiarize people with Austrian economics as there is to familiarize them with more interventionist schools of economics. Because I mean, the state has no particular interest in encouraging this, because everything we say is against the state as a parasite on society. So there's no surprise that government institutions don't exactly want to promote it. So I mean, it has certain built-in disadvantages to it from that point of view. But you're right. I mean, that once you hear it, I agree with you. I mean, when I first learned about Austrian economics, I fell instantly in love with it. I just read like a fanatic. In fact, the people who gave me these glasses even said, if you cut down on this reading, you would probably get your vision back. Well, no such luck there. But and the thing is that even in my own classes, just talking to my students, now I didn't propagandize them in the classroom, but just talk to them for 15 minutes about something that they've never heard before, or a point of view that has just never been allowed to be expressed to them. And all of a sudden, bang, light bulbs go on. They want more. They want more. I mean, I sort of feel like if we all just had each of the faculty members here, we could just have 15 minutes on TV. Man, we could make some inroads. So we have to hope that the internet will help us. It's almost a cliche, but the fact is that Mises.org, I mean, is one of the most unbelievable assets you can possibly imagine. It's got short pieces. It's got pieces for people with a very long attention span. It's got spoken word things for people who don't want to read at all. It's got everything. It's a great proselytizing and teaching device. But as I said, I think my main reason for it is that there's no real reason to want to promote it, particularly because intellectuals oftentimes want to curry favor with the establishment and want to say what the establishment wants to hear. The establishment doesn't want to hear the best thing you can do is close up shop and go home. So naturally we're at a disadvantage. But we have to hope for idealistic young people like yourself. Man, there's nothing that makes you feel older than referring to other people as young people. Man, this is killing me. Okay. What else? We have first floor people. Yes.
You talked about the movement of the farmers from the suburbs to the city, farmers to the city. Can you talk more about what measures Carson thinks caused this to happen, and the research where you think shows that wasn't a big factor?
I can actually give specific citations because I have them in my. This was in case I needed to refer to something. I don't know if it's even usable at this point, but I actually have specific citations. But one of them would be. Oh, my apologies. Yes, right. Excellent. Repeating the question. Good. The question involves, on the Industrial Revolution issue, people moving from the countryside into the cities. What is the evidence that suggests that the enclosure movement was not decisive in this? And secondly, what else, if anything, would somebody like Kevin Carson say was responsible for this phenomenon? I know that because I read it. Hartwell has a book called It's here in the Institute. In fact, I don't even know if it's been reshelved because I was just checking it to get some quotes from him. If you did a search for Hartwell and Industrial Revolution 1970, it will come up. And then he's got citations in there. Now that's a little old. I mean, naturally you'd like something from, more recent. But that, in fact, I think it's Liberty Press has this online library of liberty, and they actually have an encyclopedia article on the Industrial Revolution that's full of citations that I would refer you to. I can even print out for you. Now, I don't know specifically any more about the Carson critique, but I do know about people who are sympathetic to his point of view. Like one of the arguments that people like Chesterton and Belloc made was that there was something kind of perverted about industrialization from the beginning, in that some of the great concentrations of wealth had been created by entirely artificial means. Like, for instance, when Henry VIII confiscated the monastic properties and then more or less distributed them to influential people, and thereby creating a cadre of people who now never want him to reconcile with the Pope, because then they'll have to give their lands back to the monasteries. This is obviously not a market transaction. When the king just simply confiscates the land of the monasteries on ridiculous grounds. And so their argument was that a lot of the concentrations of wealth had these disreputable origins, and that as a result, industrial capitalism took a much more centralized form. It might have been a much more decentralized phenomenon if wealth in British society had been more decentralized. And they think that the centralization of wealth had been accelerated by the confiscation of the monasteries' properties.
Well, Suda has a post on the other side, on the optimist side,
okay.
Where he has a bunch of references.
Oh, good.
It's a post on Liberty and Power. So you go to the blog Liberty and Power and just search for Suda Shinoy enclosures. You can get a list of the pro-optimist citations.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. That was Professor Long was just suggesting for any of you out there in internet land that you should go to the Liberty and Power blog and do a search for Suda Shinoy, S-U-D-H-A, and then the word enclosures, and you'll get a list of citations along these lines. Yes, sir?
I would like to hear your opinion on the way mainstream economy gets recently. For instance, the globalization movement, what do you think about it?
Yep.
The second question I would like to make is, well, I would say that some historians have paid attention to economics, for instance, lands, for instance, lands and wealth and property of nations. He has behind it an economic reason of sorts. Even for instance, more left-wing inclined historians, for instance, Brodell, he deals extensively with economics.
Okay, these are good questions. I mean, a great example. I mean, the great in the sense of got a lot of notoriety of the example of economists and using statistical methods and applying it to history was that book Time on the Cross about American slavery, where you had Fogel and Engerman using economic analysis to try to answer questions about slavery and the conditions people lived in and how profitable it was. And I think additional tools like this can be very helpful as long as people, as long as you go into it with a kind of a good sort of philosophical grounding. Because somebody like Mark Thornton, who I don't think is here with us tonight, has really done some excellent sort of follow-up work on what people like Fogel and Engerman have done on slavery, because he, being a libertarian, I think there are two great articles waiting to be written: what Austrian economics can teach historians, and what libertarianism can teach historians. And when you're a libertarian, there are so many questions that are on the table for you that are off the table for other people that wouldn't even occur to them to put them on the table. For instance, Mark Thornton, his initial thought is, well, what, if anything, is the government doing to encourage slavery or to help make slavery more profitable? Because Fogel and Engerman are more or less concluding that it was a profitable institution. So Mark Thornton wants to know, is the government doing something that's making it more profitable? So he looks and he says, well, let's look at there are ways. The fact is that the federal government is enforcing fugitive slave legislation that socializes the costs of getting runaway slaves. And now we all have to sort of in some way pay for this. Well, naturally, that makes the institution more profitable. I mean, this is something that a libertarian, I think, is more likely to see. A libertarian economist, especially, the best kind there is. Secondly, he says that there were laws, there were anti-manumission laws that actually made it difficult, if not impossible, for you to manumit your slaves. Thornton and a couple of others have done some good, interesting work showing that federally subsidized railroads in the 1850s contributed to the profitability of slavery, because it opened up now all kinds of additional land that would have been, obviously, much too far away from any markets that no one could have been able to settle in. But now you've got tremendous opportunities for the expansion of slavery. As I say, that was encouraged by government subsidy, and there's also the possibility even of slave labor, at least the possibility of slave labor on the railroads themselves. So these are all questions that, because Mark Thornton, as a libertarian, can think of a world in which the government did not subsidize the railroads, he can ask a forbidden question like that. Wait a minute. Did that actually, in some way, indirectly prop up slavery? For most historians, it's taken for granted that since obviously we needed government subsidy of the railroads, it doesn't even become anything. It doesn't even become an actor in a causal relationship in the first place, I think. Okay, let me take maybe just this gentleman here.
Going back to the Industrial Revolution, I wanted to know how would you relate the characteristics of the Industrial Revolution to the actual things that are happening in China and India, especially on wages.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question involves, on the Industrial Revolution, the question involves how would I relate that history to present-day events? People who are working for low wages today in countries like China and India, or less developed nations and things of that sort. And I think in some ways the answer is the same. And here I very happily refer people to George Reisman's book Capitalism. If you have the strength to pick it off the shelf, you should do it. It's online also. It's fantastic. You look at it online, you think, if I don't own this thing, then I don't belong to the human race, basically. So you should get it. Sorry, that was probably a bit strong. Yeah, that's right. But what Professor Reisman points out is a point that's valid, in all times and places, which is that really the big problem is how little mechanized the production process was at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in very minimally capitalized societies today. That the more mechanized production becomes, the more goods you can produce, the more abundance you can produce in at lower cost, and this greater abundance is in effect passed on to consumers through the force of competition and in the form of cost cuts, so that people's wages, in fact real wages, increase in that there's greater abundance produced, and so their wages increase through the fact that prices become lower. So their real wages, in fact, rise. All real incomes rise as a result of this process. So what you really need is what these people need is more machines. They need more mechanization. What they don't need is a lot of romanticizing about how wonderful it was to live in the year 1303. Which I have to deal with people like this all the time who say, if only we could live in 1303. And and I think, well, I hope you're not planning on having a full life expectancy in 1303. You're about to hit the Black Death in about 45 years. But people who, would you like to go to the dentist in 1303? Would you like to live in a typical house that they would have in 1303? Would you like to have half of your children die? I mean, there's so much romanticizing of what it was like, and I just think we can have absolutely no patience with that for that whatsoever if we actually care about people's well-being. Well, I think just so that I don't wear out my welcome, and it's been a long day, and it's just about 8 o'clock. We'll adjourn for the evening, and think of the unforbidden questions we'll have over a couple of drinks. Imagine that. So thank you.